Good morning, Craig. How are you doing?
I'm great. Hope you are.
Absolutely fantastic. What an interesting book. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that my father would read. He served in World War II, and he always called books like this, this is the modern day Western, son. This is what it's all about.
Well, it was kind of like the Wild West out there in Asia where this story takes place, no question.
For you to bump into this story, how did you even find it?
So I was one of the Pentagon beat reporters for the Washington Post back in 2013, and there was a short news story that came over the news wires from San Diego about how a Navy contractor had been arrested on bribery charges, and that unusually there was a Navy officer who had been arrested as well and charged with leaking him classified information, and even an agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS. He was also charged with taking bribes. So this was pretty unusual to have a federal agent and a Navy officer arrested for bribery. So I was wandering the halls of the Pentagon and bumped into a Navy officer who I knew. I said, do you know anything about this case? And this contractor, his name is Leonard Francis, and he's from Malaysia. And the officer just got a big smile on his face and said, oh, you mean Fat Leonard. Yep. And my eyes got big. I said, oh, I like a good story. I can smell one, I smell a good story here. Is his name really Fat Leonard? And the guy laughed and said, yeah, everybody in the Navy knows Fat Leonard. So immediately at that point, I had been hooked. I wanted to know more. Who was this character? How did he bribe these people? How far did it go? And I just started digging and pulling back layer after layer. And over the last 10 years, was able to piece together that Leonard Francis had been under investigation for giving gifts to up to 1,000 Navy personnel over the years, including 90 admirals. And the scandal just kept getting bigger and bigger.
So what did he want in return? Just information? Because we're talking about some of those dinners were $1,000 per plate.
Yeah, so Leonard Francis ran a company that provided maritime services to the Navy. He was a key player for the Navy in Asia and the Western Pacific. Anytime a Navy ship or aircraft carrier or submarine came into port outside the U.S. military bases in Japan, they needed a local company to provide food, water, remove the sewage, provide tugboats, cranes, barges, you name it. Leonard kind of described himself as the Walmart for the U.S. Navy whenever it came into port. So he had contracts worth $200 million at one point to do these services for the Navy. But, that wasn't enough for Leonard. He realized that he could charge the U.S. government through the nose for his services as long as he could buy off Navy officers, get them to look the other way. So he became Good Time Leonard through these parties, gave these gifts, so that Navy officers wouldn't look at the bills and would essentially let him charge what he wanted. And it was out the nose and it was reckless for the better part of 25 years till he finally got caught.
Wow. In a really weird way, Fat Leonard was a genius.
He was. There's no question this guy was a genius. I interviewed Navy officer after Navy officer who, in all seriousness said, if he had worked for the KGB, he would have brought down the U.S. Navy. Or if he'd worked for Chinese intelligence, this would have destroyed our leadership corps. He was that good at sizing people up for their weaknesses, figuring out who would be willing to take a bribe, who had marital problems, who had drinking problems, who he could get to be his informants and his moles. At one point, he probably had 24 informants who were uniformed U.S. Navy officers embedded through the system. And just to give you a sense, they called him boss, right? It wasn't like sir. And they weren't being ironic in their emails and phone calls, say, yes, boss, what do you need? And he really, at one point, he was able to control the movement of U.S. ships. If the Navy had planned to send a ship to Singapore, he could call on his moles to say, no, don't send it to Singapore. I don't make as much money there. I want you to send it to Malaysia instead, or Thailand, somewhere where I can gouge the Navy for a lot more money. And think of that a foreign national, a Malaysian citizen, was able to dictate where U.S. warships go. That's pretty frightening.
What's really interesting about this, Craig, is that when I first heard about this story, I thought, this was back in the 1940s and 50s. This wasn't too long ago at all.
No, this started right after the Cold War when Leonard was a young man in his 20s. There was the closure of the U.S. naval base at Subic Bay in the Philippines, which at that time had been the largest U.S. Navy base overseas anywhere. And the Navy needed new places to go to send its ships to different ports in the region. It didn't have that base in Southeast Asia anymore. So they needed a private contractor to supply these services during port visits. And Leonard stepped into the void starting in the early 90s. His company was small at that point, but he kept growing and growing, getting more contracts in more countries. But again, this formula he had where whenever a ship would come into port, he would throw these wild parties, sometimes with prostitutes. Sometimes if he needed to give people cash bribes, he would do that. But the Navy really saw him as this good time Charlie that would give them a taste of the high life that they couldn't afford as U.S. military personnel. But again, and then they would all look the other way while he billed the snot out of the U.S. government.
Wow. Was he ever on the up and up? I mean, could you trust him?
Well, that was one of the things. His services were pretty good.
Okay.
The reason the Navy kept using him was, for the most part, he was pretty reliable. That if the Navy needed to go into a new port, or like in India, or they need to send an aircraft carrier to a country it had never visited before, Leonard would be there, and he'd have his barges and his tugboats and whatever equipment was necessary. He was there, and he provided a pretty good service. But he realized that people in the Navy really didn't care what he charged as long as he provided the service.
But you know what's really interesting about this is as he gets in trouble and people start following him, I love the fact that the Cuban leaders wouldn't let him in the country. They knew who this guy was, therefore he went to Venezuela.
Man, after he got arrested in 2013 in San Diego, he pleaded guilty. It looked like he was going to be in jail for a long, long time. But he conned a federal judge and the Justice Department into thinking he was dying of cancer and conned them into saying, you have to let me out of jail so I can get medical treatment. Now, he was sick. He did have kidney cancer, but he wasn't dying like he said he was. And so he had this crazy arrangement where he was supposed to be on federal home detention in San Diego, but he paid for his own guards. And he was staying in a $5,000 a month mansion in San Diego that he paid for with money he stole from the Navy. And then finally in 2022, so a couple years ago now, he decided, I don't want to go back to jail. My sentencing's coming up. I'm going to make a run for it. So over Labor Day weekend, he cut off this ankle bracelet, this electronic monitoring device around his leg, walked outside, hailed an Uber, headed to the border crossing at Tijuana, Mexico, then flew on to Cuba thinking I'll be able to seek refuge there. The Cubans, you're right, they didn't want Leonard. They didn't want this kind of trouble with the United States government. So they sent him onward. He went to Venezuela, and he was running around the beaches of Venezuela for a couple of weeks. So he was finally picked up there on an Interpol warrant. And he was eventually brought back to the United States in a prisoner swap this past December, and a deal orchestrated by criminals was that the White House had to get involved in negotiating his return to U.S. custody.
There's such a side of me that goes, there's no way this is a real story, but it is a real story, and DiCaprio has got to play this guy in a movie.
Well, it's funny. Leonard also has one of the biggest egos of anybody I've ever come across. He loves all the media coverage of his case. And years ago, he'd already decided who he wanted to play him in a Hollywood movie. And it wasn't Leonardo DiCaprio, even though he probably would have liked his name, Leonardo. But he decided that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson would be a better choice to play him.
Oh, my God.
So we laugh, but this was his serious choice.
And one of the things that listeners need to understand, the confessions. I mean, there really was some.
There were. And so in the course of my reporting, I was able to get my hands on a mother lode of investigative files that NCIS and the Justice Department had pulled together over several years. They had conducted secret interrogations of numerous admirals and senior Navy officers where they would, it's like what you see in the movies almost. They would put wires on or recorders in their pocket, and they would record these admirals being interrogated. And I was able to get my hands on those transcripts. And a lot of these people thought that they could get away with their crimes or get away with taking bribes from Leonard Francis, because who would ever find out, and how could anyone prove it? The problem was, at that point, Leonard had turned state's evidence. He'd agreed to cooperate with the Justice Department. This was going on secretly, but he was giving federal agents all this information on people he bribed over the years. The other important thing is that Leonard was a pack rat. He kept everything. He had emails, text messages, photographs, even Christmas cards that these Navy officers had sent him over the years, thanking him for the gifts, for the vacations, for the dinners. If he'd take them to $1,000 a head dinner, he'd have people sign commemorative menus. He kept all that stuff and handed it over to the feds. So when they interrogated the admirals and the senior officers, they had all that hard evidence that, yes, they knew Leonard. Yes, they had gone to his dinners. Yes, they had taken the bribes and the prostitutes. So when you read these transcripts, they're literally just stammering when they get asked questions about these episodes. And that, to me, as a reporter, I've never come across anything like that before.
I can't imagine that paper trail. I mean, they always tell us that we should create a paper trail, but my God, the truth was all right there.
It was. And again, the shocking thing, frankly, is that these Navy officers were so stupid, right? They set themselves up for blackmail. They left a paper trail. There was one officer who actually testified in court that he had gone to this over-the-top dinner with champagne and 10 courses that Leonard had hosted in Sydney, Australia, for officers on the USS Blue Ridge, which was the 7th Fleet flagship. And Leonard had them all sign a commemorative copy of the menu. And this officer said he knew this was going to come back to haunt him one day, right? He knew this was going to come up in a criminal trial somehow. He saw his future flash before his eyes, but he said the other officers all signed it, so he'd look like a snitch or something if he didn't. So he did too. And sure enough, it came back to haunt them all. And this was an exhibit in a criminal trial.
Wow. 440 people, including 60 admirals. Did anybody have to spend some time in jail?
So some did. There have been about a couple dozen defendants who were charged by the Justice Department who had to spend time in jail. But the bigger story, which I was able to find out in the book, is actually the scope of the case was even bigger than the numbers you just rattled off. It turned out there were nearly 1,000 people who came under investigation, including 90 admirals. But the scandal of the scandal is that very few of those admirals got in trouble. Only one went to jail for 18 months. The rest of them, maybe a few got slaps on the wrist from the Navy. They got official censures or were forced to retire, but only one spent time in prison of all those admirals.
Wow. Now, let me ask you this question. In reading the book, if somebody has served this nation in the Navy, are they going to be emotionally involved in the way of saying, how stupid can these people that I'm with every day be?
No question. I think the people who have read the book or have heard about the story, the people who get most angry are U.S. military personnel, veterans or active duty, who do things right. That they are the upstanding people with high integrity, and it angers them the most of what these fellow veterans and officers got away with this kind of behavior over the years. So there's no question. I think it is emotional for a lot of Navy folks and veterans from other services to read a book like this. They feel not only did these people betray their country, but they betrayed them, their veterans and other service members. And, I think that's going to be something that's going to be difficult for a lot of people to process.
I love how authentic you have made this book. And the reason why is because I love it when I can have the facts and figures right here in front of me, because I feel like I'm right there with you and we're trying to get to the end of this.
Well, I appreciate that. It is important to note for this book, it's all based on the record interviews and official documents I was able to get my hands on. So, there's no blind quotes in this. There's no made up quotes after the fact. It's all from emails, documents, interrogation transcripts, on the record interviews. So, and I cite all of this in the sources at the end of the book. So it's all laid out there. This isn't one of these fake news situations where people have to wonder where the news is coming from. It's all laid out in black and white. And so it is one of those stories that the truth is stranger than fiction, but fortunately, in this case, I was able to document it extensively.
The scariest thing about this whole entire thing, this Fat Leonard guy, is the fact that this guy had so much information that did that not interrupt our national security?
it was an enormous threat to national security. And this, again, is where stupidity came into play for these Navy officers who took his bribes. And I'll give you an example of this. So besides having all his parties and dinners, Leonard he was a master of espionage. He was able to cultivate 10 different US Navy officers to leak him military secrets. And they did this over a period of 7 years. So for 7 years, at his beck and call, he had military officers leaking him classified information about, and most of it was about the movement of US ships and submarines in the Pacific, which was information that, posed a real risk to the safety of US crews throughout the region if our adversaries had gotten their hands on it. But at one point, he had one officer leaking him information about ballistic missile defense operations.
Oh, wow.
So this was serious top secret stuff that Leonard, who was a foreigner, a Malaysian citizen, was able to get his hands on. There's really been no case like this in modern history where one foreigner was able to recruit 10 military officers to leak him classified information. So, that takes it from the, haha, isn't this funny, the scam he ran, to this was a serious threat to national security.
So is it because he was a master at selling the spots off a leopard? I mean, he obviously had to have been a phenomenal salesperson.
He was, as one Navy officer described him, he was a master at human study. He could size up people's weaknesses very easily. He knew, one of his favorite sayings was every sailor has a weakness. And so he would figure out who was having marital troubles, who had a drinking problem, who needed money, who let their hair down too much at certain points. He'd study people and he'd collect intelligence from his informants and the rest of the Navy about certain individuals. He'd study them from a distance. He was really good at sizing people up. He was very charming. He was sort of this rogue villain, but he's a very charming individual. And so even if you knew he was trouble, he was hard to avoid getting in a conversation with because he was such a charismatic figure. But all along, he's very calculating. He's sizing people up, trying to figure out how where the chink in your armor is.
Mm-hmm. So now, you being associated with, as a journalist, with the Pentagon and being with the Navy itself, did you have to go through any special clearance to release this book, have them edit it before it came to us?
Well, no, I'm an independent journalist for the Washington Post. So even though I covered the Navy and covered the Pentagon, we have the First Amendment and the free press in this country, so we don't need clearance from the government to do it. Yeah. But we're very careful about our reporting to make sure everything's accurate. Like I said, everything in the book is documented in the source notes, and this is all on the record. It's official documents. There's nothing in the book that's classified or anything like that. It's just going to be really painful for people in the Navy and the Pentagon to read.
Who are you doing next? Because this book isn't the end of your journey, so you've got to be investigating somebody next.
Well, that's true, but that's a secret till it comes out. I've got to keep that quiet. Sorry, that's classified at my newspaper, so to speak.
All right, what's a website then where people can go to give you some love then, Craig?
So SimonandSchuster.com. Simon & Schuster is the publisher of the book, Fat Leonard. I'm also can be found at WashingtonPost.com.
I love it. Please come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
Really enjoyed it.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay, sir?
You too. Thanks so much for your time.